George Washington has become immortalized as an American hero over the past 2 centuries, his legacy as a leader and unifier unmatched by any subsequent president. He is featured heavily in pop culture and referenced frequently in modern politics. So who was the father of the United States? George Washington was born on February 22, 1732, to Augustine and Mary Ball Washington. At the time of his birth, his family lived on a 1,300-acre plantation called Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. Those who lived on the plantation included 20 to 25 enslaved people, George Washington and his parents, and his 2 half-brothers from Augustine's previous marriage. George would eventually become the eldest of 6 children between Augustine and Mary. Around 1734, the Washington family moved to a land called Epsawison, which Augustine renamed Little Hunting Creek Plantation, and George would later rename Mount Vernon, located on the Potomac River. In 1738, the Washingtons moved again to the location that would be most commonly associated with George Washington's youth, Ferry Farm, which was a plantation on the Rappahannock River near Fredericksburg, Virginia. George Washington's childhood is not well documented. His father Augustine died when he was 11, leaving many of his properties to George's much older half-brothers. Mary, George, and the other Washington children continued to live at Ferry Farm, and as the eldest, George likely helped his mother run the estate. Ferry Farm produced tobacco, the cash crop of the time, which contributed to the Washingtons' wealth and status, but relied heavily on enslaved Africans to cultivate the tobacco. To put this into context, at the age of 11, George inherited 10 enslaved people from his father, and over the course of his life would eventually enslave as many as 500 African people. In many ways, George Washington grew up similarly to other elite people of the time, but strangely, he never attended college or received a formal education. He probably had private tutors and might have attended a local school in Fredericksburg where he learned reading, writing, basic legal forms, geometry, and trigonometry. Washington was trained in surveying during his early teens and quickly dove into surveying as a career path. His first project was to survey 5 acres near Mount Vernon, but by the age of 16, he was invited by George William Fairfax to join a survey party and travel western Virginia for a month, laying out lots of land. At 17, the College of William and Mary commissioned him to survey Culpeper County, during which he measured a 400-acre tract of land in 2 days. George had become acquainted with Robert Dinwiddie, governor of Virginia, through his older brother. Through this connection, George was appointed as a major in Virginia's militia in 1753. George's first major task was to deliver a message to French soldiers who had slowly encroached into British land around the modern area of western Pennsylvania. A frontiersman named Christopher Gist, a Seneca leader named Tanaquarison, 2 other Iroquois chiefs, and a Delaware chief led him to the French. This would be called the Allegheny Expedition, and an account of this journey was published in Williamsburg, Virginia, and London, gaining George Washington international reputation. A few months later, Governor Dinwiddie sent Lieutenant Colonel George Washington to assert Virginia's claim in western Pennsylvania. Washington's confrontation led to a skirmish during which he had to retreat to hastily build a fort, which he called Fort Necessity. Ultimately, he had to surrender to the French, and his humiliation resulted in his resignation. Even though he resigned, George Washington volunteered to aid General Edward Braddock in the Ohio region. When Braddock retreated, George was left to lead a crumbling band of British soldiers. 2 horses were shot out from under him, and his coat had 4 bullet holes through it. He was highly praised for his valiance and given command of Virginia's entire military force. When conflict ended in 1758, he returned to his plantation, Mount Vernon. Washington married widow Martha Dandridge Custis in 1759. Together they oversaw the farms of Mount Vernon from 1759 to 1775, and Martha maintained Mount Vernon while George was away with military service. Washington dabbled in both wheat and tobacco, as well as milling. He also experimented with fertilizers, crop rotations, tools, and animal husbandry. After the battles of Lexington and Concord, George Washington was appointed to take command of the Continental Army and besiege the British in Boston. He wrote to Martha telling her that he would be home in the fall, but would end up being away at war for 8 years. Washington focused most of his attention on British-controlled New York for a significant portion of the war. George Washington fought in a little over a dozen out of 230 battles of the American Revolution, all of which were in New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, except for the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. He was pushed across the Delaware River into New Jersey and then into Pennsylvania after numerous defeats, but was able to shift the tides in his favor with an unexpected attack on Christmas night in 1776 at Fort Trenton. From there, he was able to continue his siege on New York until French allies under the Comte de Rochambeau arrived in 1780. The united forces of George Washington and the Comte de Rochambeau saw an opportunity to deal a major blow to the British in 1871 when British Lieutenant General Cornwallis left the Carolinas after a siege of defeats to recover in Yorktown, Virginia. In only a couple of weeks, Washington and Rochambeau forced Cornwallis's surrender at the Battle of Yorktown, and although this was the last major battle of the war, the treaty ending the American Revolution would not come for another 2 years. On December 23, 1783, Washington resigned from his commission and returned to Mount Vernon, hoping that he had concluded his time serving in public life. George Washington's self-imposed retirement did not last very long, though. He came back to public service in 1787 after his growing frustration with the Continental Congress and the weakness of the Articles of Confederation came to a peak. Upon his return, he was unanimously chosen to lead the Constitutional Convention which ratified the Constitution. Intending to return to Mount Vernon, Washington's plans were foiled again when every elector voted for him to become the first president. George Washington served 2 terms as president. His first term was focused on organizing the executive branch and establishing administrative procedures, such as establishing the tradition of a cabinet of advisors, signing into law the first copyright law, and ratifying the Bill of Rights. During his second term, he was focused on foreign affairs, sparked by Europe's fall into war in 1793 after the French Revolution. He established neutrality between France and England, and signed the Jay's Treaty, Pinckney's Treaty, and Treaty of Tripoli. In 1797, George Washington chose to end his presidency after 2 terms. Even during his presidency, George was focused on Mount Vernon. His military career and time as president left a lasting impact on George. His view on slavery changed over time. Although he never publicly lobbied for abolition, Washington chose to free the 123 enslaved people he held in bondage outright in his will upon the death of his wife, Martha. By the time of his death, Washington had expanded his plantation from 2,000 to 8,000 acres, with more than 3,000 being used specifically for crop cultivation. On December 12, 1799, George Washington was out on horseback supervising farm activities from late morning until 3 in the afternoon. The weather shifted from light snow to hail and then to rain. He arrived just in time for dinner and, known for his punctuality, did not take the time to change out of his damp clothes before sitting down at the table. Around 2 in the morning, he awoke with a terrible sore throat. Medical treatment was sought, but his condition continued to worsen as the night wore on. Between 10 and 11 at night, on December 14, 1799, George Washington passed away. His wife Martha, friends Dr. Craik and Tobias Lear, enslaved housemaids Caroline Banham, Molly, and Charlotte, and his valet Christopher Shields were around for his final hours. George Washington has a complex legacy. His successes and failures paint the history of our nation, and his life has been mythologized to the point of propaganda at times in American history. When people think of the American Revolution, they think of America's father, George Washington. They think of his humble rise to the presidency and his solemn departure, warning America of the troubles it could face without a clear and strong leader who had the nation's best interests at heart. When talking about figures like George Washington, it's important to remember that he was a human being just like anyone else, with strengths and weaknesses, with triumphs and shortcomings. Just as George Washington was hypercritical of his own life and legacy, so too must we be when we look at how he's used in media and in pop culture today. Only by looking at the imperfections of people in the past can we look at imperfections of the people around us and in ourselves and grow to become a more perfect union.